This is my desire to honor you, Lord, with all my heart I worship you. All I have within me, I give you praise. All that I adore is in you. Lord, I give you my heart, I give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. For those of you who haven't heard that song before, it's almost like a prayer. And as you sing it, think really strong on those words. Mean them in your heart. Pray them straight up to God. It's a powerful prayer. And if you pray it and you mean it, it could change your life this morning. Let's sing it through one more time. This is my desire to honor you, Lord, with all my heart I worship you. And all I have within me, I give you praise. All that I adore is in you. And Lord, I give you my heart, I give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me. Lord, I give you my heart, I give you my soul. I live for you alone. Every breath that I take, every moment I'm awake, Lord, have your way in me.
Reading today, we'll be reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. Book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 through 3. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains I will tell thee. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him.
Good morning. I always get nervous when I see Preacher with Water. I'm like, how long are they going to be here? It's not going to be that long. It's summertime. We all need to drink our water. Before we get started, I need to do something to prepare you guys for the message today. Namely, tell you I emailed the wrong services, so we're actually going to be doing the PM service right now. So, and you're looking at your notes, we're going to look down at the PM service. So now you guys are ready. And when I was younger, and as I get older, sometimes I like to use the notes to kind of time out the message. You guys maybe know what I'm saying. You know, there's 3 things. You figure about a third of the way for each, and as you cross them off or fill them in. I'm not doing that, so don't freak out. Mine are going to be all right at the end. So don't worry. It's not like I'm not getting started. Just we're going to save those blanks till the end. So no worries there. You don't have to be thinking about that for the rest of the time now. Well, now that I've prepared you, I need you to prepare me. So let's bow in prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you so much for this opportunity to gather as a body of believers, as a family of God, to open up your scriptures, to learn from your word. I pray this morning your Holy Spirit would speak, that it would move in our lives, that regardless of the words that I speak this morning, you would touch our hearts and you would give us the message we need to hear today, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, I got to hear this fun story the other day, and I'm going to share it with you guys. There's a lot of hiking. Do you guys ever go hiking around here? I've gone hiking a couple of times, but it seems like whenever I watch the news, the accidents always seem to happen on like Camelback Mountain. That seems to be like the dangerous one. Have you guys heard? Like, it seems like every time there's an accident hiking, it's always Camelback Mountain. I'm like, why do people keep going there? That's not a safe place. But there was a gentleman who was hiking, probably on a place like Camelback Mountain. He was on an unsure path, kind of by the edge of the mountain. And as he's hiking along, he all of a sudden hits some loose rocks, loses his balance, and falls over the edge. He's grabbing to the side of that mountain, dangling, and he's in trouble. So he hollers up. Help, is there anybody up there? All of a sudden he hears a response, and it's God. And he says, I'm here. I can help you. He's like, who is this? Like, it's God. And it's like, thank you. He's like, this is what you have to do. Just let go, and I'll catch you. He's like, just let go from your dangling position, and I will catch you. The man holds on, looks around a little bit, looks up again, and hollers, is there anybody else up there? You know, sometimes letting go, giving up control isn't an easy thing to do. Sometimes as I think about it, I'm like, yeah, I could probably do that. But when you're in the situation, it's a little bit different. When you're there dangling and you don't see anything there for support. Today, we're going to look a little bit in Genesis 22. We're going to be at the front part of that passage. We're going to be looking at the life of Abraham a little bit, and a little bit of what surrender looks like in his life. And before we get started, though, I want to just give you a little bit of backstory. You guys probably all know this, but I'm going to say it just in case we've forgotten or missed a part. God made Abraham a promise, right? He made him a promise about having tons of kids, or a nation made out of him, right? And Abraham's pretty old when he gets that promise. And so after a bit of time, he says, you know what? Him and his wife decide we're gonna try doing this thing and kind of kickstarting this process. So Abraham has a child, but not with Sarah. Instead, he does it with her handmaiden. And so Ishmael is born. And, Ishmael, I realized, was born because Abraham and Sarah decided they wanted to help God keep his promise. And as I started thinking about that, I thought, we don't really have to ever help God keep a promise. As people, we oftentimes like to take control. We like to do things ourselves. It's hard to give up the power. And if we've been promised things, we've been promised lots of things in the Scripture. And sometimes we want to, maybe help God along a little bit, kind of like Abraham and Sarah did. But God doesn't need our help to keep his promises. And so that kind of started a bit of trouble. But after the Ishmael thing happened, then Isaac gets born. And they do things God's way. And Isaac is born, the fulfillment of God's promise, the hope of future promises. He's just this precious blessing from God given to Abraham and Sarah in a miraculous way. Even back then when they lived older, that was not a normal thing. And so I'm a huge fan of names and meanings of names. And the name Isaac, he was called Isaac, means he laughs. And a lot of times, maybe you've noticed this with your kids, when you name a child, the meaning of their name really seems to encapsulate who that child becomes. And it surprises me every time. And so to think of Isaac as someone who laughs, I can just imagine he brought so much joy to the household. Not only is he a gift from God, but he just brings laughter and happiness and encouragement with him. Now, we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 22 of Genesis. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am." I'm going to stop just for a moment. I thought that was weird when it said that God tempted Abraham. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. I thought Satan tempts people. But when I was looking at what the word tempt means, it's another translation would maybe make it clearer, test. So God tested Abraham. Now, I know everyone here loves taking tests, right? Everyone's like, yeah, in school that was my favorite. Taking tests, maybe not the most fun thing, and that's kind of what Abraham's getting into here, a time of testing. And so here's the test. The test starts in verse 2. And God said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. So God issues this test. And the thing that really blows me away is Abraham's response to this unusual request. It was instant obedience. Instant obedience is a thing that I think maybe that's a term that was just in my house, and I've kind of held on to it. But maybe you guys have heard that, when you tell someone something, you expect instant obedience. That was my father. My father was like, when I say something, I expect instant obedience. And I was like, okay, I'll try. I didn't succeed often. But now that I'm older, I get it. I'm like, yeah, right, that makes more sense. Kids running to the street, stop. If they don't obey, dead child. Instant obedience can be very important in life. Now, Abraham, the next morning, he gets the instructions, and the next morning, boom, he's going. He's on his way to obey. I thought it was kind of funny because whereas he moved instantly to obey, a lot of times in place of instant obedience, I like to add other Christian thoughts. Like, let me pray about this for a little bit. Maybe I should consider my options here. Think through this. Maybe I should talk it over with my spouse, see if she's getting that from God too. Just maybe, is that what God's saying to you? I mean, I thought so. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not right. But if I'd been Abraham, I would have been like, this doesn't seem logical or rational. Let's think this through a little bit. Let's not get hasty. Look before you leap kind of thing. But Abraham had such a relationship with God that he knew it was God talking to him. He didn't doubt the voice of God. He knew what it was. When he heard it, he knew enough about God that he knew to obey. Wouldn't it be great in our lives if when we were told something by God, we knew instantly that is God because our relationship was so close to him, and because we know that is God, there's no room for delaying. Why put off doing what is right? So, verse 4 moves on. They're now traveling. He gets up, he obeys. Gets the wood, gets the kid, gets some help, saddles up the donkey, and we go. It says, Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. I just got back from a trip, and I actually spent about 3 days traveling. And 3 days is a long time to travel. Even when you're using fast transportation, it just feels, it wears on you. And as a father, you're always, thinking about everybody else because you want them to be safe, you want them to get where they're going, all this stuff. Now, Abraham had kind of a different scenario on his travels. The whole time, for 3 days now, he has got to be thinking about his destination, about what he is about to do, about what he's been asked to do. And he's walking side by side with his son, the son that God himself admitted Abraham loved. And for 3 days, I can only imagine for 3 days, every single step would have brought him closer and closer to the inevitable loss that was coming. Boy, as a father, I can just imagine that would tear at your heart every single step. You know, when you take a journey on plane, you get on the plane, you take a nap, you get off the plane, you've gone 3,000 miles. It's great. It's, closest thing to transporter we have. But he had to walk this, and he had to make the decision to obey every single step. I don't know how far you guys have walked, but sometimes, the longest regular kind of walk, sometimes I'll walk like a mile or two to like a Walgreens to pick something up if I need to. And some days when it's really hot, I'll get a couple blocks away and I'm like, maybe I should just turn back. I don't really need the water right now. I could wait till I'm going on another errand to go get it. Just turn back. For 3 days, every step he had to decide to follow after God. Following God in our daily lives sometimes feels like that. Just every single step, every single decision has to be made intentionally to do what God is asking us to do, because he doesn't always ask us to do easy things. So, for 3 days, then all of a sudden they see it in the distance. He sees the end in sight. I'm sure that, quickened his pulse a little bit. Well, there it is. And in verse 5, it says, "And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together." I want to just stop for a second, because when I was growing up, I heard this story. You all heard this story. And I always wondered, how old was Isaac? It might seem insignificant, but, when you tell a story, if I were to tell you I was trapped for 3 days in an airport with my son, if you knew my son was 2 years old, you would have different things imagining than if you thought my son was 30 years old. Like, it'd be a different kind of situation going on in the airport. A lot less diaper changes. But, hopefully. But it doesn't say in the Bible. It does not say how old Isaac is here. I looked a long time. It doesn't say it. But we do have clues about how old Isaac was. And I think by following those clues, we can get a better idea of exactly what's going on in this scenario. So Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. All right? And the very first verse of the next chapter, that's when his mom dies. And at that point, he's 37. So we know for sure, at this point, he is between 0 and 37. Somewhere in that window. Now, I realize it's kind of a large gap, but we can kind of rule out some of the younger ages, because Abraham laid enough wood on him. He carried wood to a distant mountain and up a mountain, enough wood to consume an entire human body, because that's what the sacrifice was. And Abraham, he did a lot of sacrifices. He knew how much wood was needed. So the guy is strong enough to at least hold a lot of wood. Now, Abraham is 100 plus whatever age Isaac is. So if Isaac is 20, then Abraham would be 120. If Isaac is 30, then Abraham's 130. Now, I don't know exactly, but when Abraham calls him a lad, I don't know, some of you guys might look at me and be like, what a lad. I'm 30, and some of you might refer to me as a lad. So Abraham's perspective on Isaac, now I'm not saying you guys are 130, don't get me wrong. That's not where I'm going with this. Some of you guys are looking at me with a dirty look, and you're like, what are you saying? I'm not saying that. But Abraham, regardless of how old Isaac is 100 years older. So he's a lot older than Isaac. So we know that Isaac is younger than 37 and old enough to carry a lot of heavy wood a long distance and up a mountain. So to me, that makes a difference, because when I was younger, I assumed Isaac was younger. I was 6, then Isaac's 6. I turned 10, I heard the story, Isaac's now 10. And as I get older, I think to myself, well, gosh, Isaac could have been my age. I mean, that falls in the space. But if I think of Isaac as closer to my age now, the story takes on just a little different feel to me as I think about this young man traveling with his older father to obey God. We're going to keep moving on. So Isaac, in verse 7, it says, "And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son." Don't you like it how they have that little back and forth? I think they could have condensed that a bit, but Isaac says, "Dad," and Abraham says, "Yeah." And Isaac says, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" They write it so nicely in this version. But in my head, I'm thinking to myself, if the dad's 100 years older, Isaac's got to be going, I think he forgot something. Have you guys ever been on a trip with somebody? You leave, and you got an older person with you, and you're like, did you forget something? You're driving off, and you got an empty tank. Maybe we should fill up with gas. Actually, typically it's Sarah talking to me. But Isaac's like, Dad, you might know this. I'm just noticing to sacrifice, we might need a sacrifice. Just throwing it out there. And so Isaac's like, Dad, did you forget the lamb? And Abraham responds, verse 8, "And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering." So they went, both of them together. I'm not sure, as a son, if my dad responded to me like that, I would let it lie. I might keep the thing, are you sure? Have you talked with him? I mean, are you sure? But I think it's really interesting that Isaac had such a good relationship with his father, and it was obvious to him that his dad was tight with God. If his dad said, God said this, he believed him wholeheartedly and immediately. He didn't question it. I bet he'd seen that in the past. I bet Abraham's life was full of moments where he talked with God and had such a close relationship with God that if Abraham said, God said this to me, Isaac didn't doubt it. Not for a second. He's like, you said that, Dad? Good enough for me. I'm with you. And they went together, side by side, single vision, single purpose, together. Makes me feel guilty. As a father, man, my kids question me. I don't know if you guys' kids ever question you. And I give an answer sometimes, and I'm like, surely I've built enough cred with them. They could just trust me a little bit. Do you know, my son Toby's very good with directions, and sometimes when we go back to the parked car, he'll want to tell me where the parked car is. I'm like, Toby, I know where the car is. Now, I say that about 50% of the time I don't, and so that's why he doesn't believe me. He doesn't trust me because I get lost so often. But when Abraham says, God said this to me, instantly he's like, okay, I've seen this before. It's always consistent. I can trust this. I can put my faith in God and in his talking with my dad. That's quite an example for a father to be like that, have such a close relationship with God, that if you talk to your child, say, you know what, God's been talking to me about this, they can be like, oh, okay, I believe that, because I've seen it before. Verse 9, and they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. So, I'm going to go back to the ages. I know that might not seem terribly important, but if Abraham's 100 years older than him, and he chose Isaac as the carrier of the wood, at this point, Isaac has figured out what's going on. If he hasn't been told directly, he gets it, okay? And I don't imagine that Abraham, snuck up behind him and tackled him and tied him up and ha-ha, gotcha. No, it wasn't that kind of a relationship. I imagine this was a really sad moment when Abraham said, well, this is what God said, and Isaac had to be a little surprised. But not only did Abraham obey, Isaac obeyed. Even though it doesn't tell us that Isaac heard directly from God, Isaac still obeyed the instructions from God. It says that Abraham built the altar. He laid the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son. A son has to be obedient for that to happen. If Isaac didn't want that to happen, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, if Isaac had time to run, he sees his dad doing stuff, he sees the ropes, he can figure stuff out. I don't think Isaac was stupid. And I don't think Abraham had to overpower him. I think he saw what was going on and accepted what God had said to do. I don't know what would have been a harder position to be in, Abraham's or Isaac's. As you put yourself in each of their places, they each had to be obedient, but they each had to be obedient in a different way to a different source of authority. God had an ultimate source of authority, and Abraham listened to God, and he obeyed. Even to his precious son, he obeyed to give it up. Then Isaac heard through his father the authority of God. And he had to submit to that authority. He chose to obey regardless of the results to himself. He trusted God more than he trusted himself. Sometimes it's easy when God is speaking to us to feel like maybe we know better. You know, God says to do something like, okay, that's a good idea, God, but I've got a better one. Okay, how about we not do that? But you know what? Isaac heard from his father what God said, and he submitted and he obeyed, no matter how hard it was. So, verse 10 through 12 then says, "And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, from me." Abraham loved his son. God knew Abraham loved his son. It might have been the most precious thing in the world to him. It was the embodiment of a kept promise, of a miracle, of a hope and a future. And when he was asked to give it up, he did it immediately for God. Perhaps you guys have heard the phrase, the history repeats itself. Have you guys heard? Give me a nod if you've heard that phrase. Yeah, history repeats itself. I saw a t-shirt the other day, it made me laugh. It said, if history repeats itself, I am totally getting a dinosaur. I don't think that's exactly what the phrase means, but this kind of thing, this kind of scenario can play out in our lives as well, where we have something precious, and God calls on us to give it up for him. So as we think about how Abraham went through this with God and with the decisions he made, let's put ourselves in our present day time in that scenario. It started out with God speaking. Here's the notes parts for those of you who, you don't have to write this down, but God speaks. He spoke to Abraham. He can speak to us. God speaks. But when God speaks, are we going to recognize his voice like Abraham did? Are we in a position where when God speaks, we're going to recognize it? Being prepared is a really big thing. There's a passage in the New Testament that talks about the disciples when they went out and they came across this man who had a demon, and they went to cast him out and it didn't work. And they come back to Jesus and said, Jesus, we met this guy and he's stronger than you. What's going on? We couldn't cast out the demon. And Jesus comes over there and he casts out the demon. And they go, why couldn't we do that? Because they were doing everything he was doing. They should have been able to do the same things he did. He said, why couldn't we do that? If you did it, why can't we? And Jesus responded, well, these kinds only come out with much prayer and fasting. Jesus was prepared. He didn't have to be like, oh, this is going to be a tough one. I need to start praying and fasting so I'm ready. No, he came to the position of the trial, of the thing that was going on, and he had already been praying. He had already been fasting, and he was ready. Are we going to be ready when the time comes that God's voice comes to us? Are we going to be in such a relationship that we're going to recognize it when we hear it? Because we don't want to miss God's voice. When he speaks into our lives, we want to be ready to hear from God. Second thing is then we get to respond. Now, there's a lot of different ways we can respond. We heard and saw and read how Abraham responded. Instant obedience. Wouldn't that be great if we could just be like, that's how I'm going to respond? When God speaks to me, boom, instant obedience. I'm guessing Abraham was practiced. I'm guessing he was ready to obey, and he always obeyed. How are we going to respond? Are we going to ignore it? I'm not sure that was God. I don't hear anything. Are we going to argue with it? Are we going to question it? Are you sure that's what I should be doing, God? If you're sure, then tell me again. Okay, I heard it again. Now tell me one more time, just to be sure. Okay, I'm going to ask you again tomorrow, just to make sure. Are we going to spend time in prayer? Just, let's pray about it for a while. I'm going to sit on this for a week, just to make sure. We're just going to wait. Say, you know what? That's a good idea, God, but I think your timing's a bit off. If I just wait until next week, then I'll be paid, and then I can do this thing, and it'll work out better for everybody. How are we going to respond when we hear God's voice? And the third thing is, give up what is most precious to us. Hopefully we all know that God is a jealous God. He loves us, but he expects to be first place in our lives. And you know what? Sometimes I'm not sure if he is in my life. He's blessed me with so many awesome things, and I enjoy the blessings that God has given me. But sometimes I take those blessings, those gifts from God, and I start enjoying them to the extent that I'm now just focusing on the blessing and not on the blesser. And when it comes to a point where God asks you to give something up, what is too much? Is there a thing in your life that would just be a little too much to ask? God, I'd give up. I laugh, and I wasn't going to mention this, but sometimes when Sarah and I pray together, or when we're talking about different prayer things that we've had, we're like, I wonder someday. I don't think this is happening. At this point, God has not called us to the missions field at all. But every now and again, everyone probably thinks and prays, is God ever going to call me somewhere else? Is God ever? And every now and again, Sarah will be like, I just hope he doesn't call us to wherever. He's like, just don't call me to pretty much any place with massively large spiders. She's like, just, God, don't call us anywhere with large spiders. And yeah, so, hopefully that wouldn't be the deal breaker. Hopefully that wouldn't be the thing that is more important than obeying God. I don't think it is. We have our fears, but we learn to give them over to God. But what is it in your life, in our lives, that we're like, you know what, if God asked that of me, that would be too much. I hope he doesn't ask that, because that would just be a step farther than I'm willing to go for him. I know he loves me, and I love him, but I don't know if I love him that much. Is there something in your life that if God asked you to give it up, you might not be on speaking terms for a while? Be like, we're just going to have a little cool down period until he gets his mind right. And then we'll talk again when he realizes this isn't a big deal. I'm in control of this thing, and it's okay. There are lots of things that God might call us to give up. Think about, what is it in our lives that we hold most dear? In your life, what do you hold most dear? It might be a possession. It might be a spouse. It might be a child. For me, it's easier to think about, maybe if he asked me to give up a possession, sure. I don't have that many of them. I can give them up, no problem. What if he asked you, what if he asked you to give up a spouse? What if you lost your spouse? What if you lost a child? That would be less easy for me. Do I hold people in my life more dearly than I hold God? Do we hold on to things so tightly that if we were asked to give it up, we would rather live in disobedience? Sometimes God's going to ask us to give things up, and we're going to choose instant obedience or instant disobedience. It's going to be one or the other. One of the things that I really like about this story is that not only was Abraham a great example in this instance of how to obey God, but we also see that God doesn't want to take things from us. He just wants to be number one. God didn't take Isaac away. He just wanted to be sure that Abraham's priorities were right. He didn't say, Abraham, I want you to love Isaac less. He said, Abraham, I want you to love me more. In our lives, he doesn't necessarily want us to love things or people less. He doesn't want us to love our blessings less. He wants to make sure that we are loving him more. More than anything he's given us, whether it be thing or person, he wants to make sure he is number one. And so if he asks us to give it up, just because he asks us to give it up doesn't mean he's going to take it away. He might, though. You know, when we hear stories like the three in the fiery furnace, it's always such an exciting story to hear about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, they stand up to the king, and he throws them in the furnace, and they're like, our God's stronger than you. And God's like, I'm here, and I am stronger. And I'm like, oh, man, it's a powerful story. But the stories you don't hear is the hundreds of thousands of times it's happened and the people burned to death. Because you know what? Just because God can save us doesn't mean he will. Just because God is more powerful than anyone else doesn't mean that he's going to choose to save us. He's God. He's good. He's just. But that doesn't mean we have to understand him. That doesn't mean that our way is his way. So maybe he's going to ask you to give something up, and you're going to give it up, and it's going to be gone, and it's not going to be easy. Don't be like, hey, wait, what about that story when you didn't actually take it? You know, it's easy to give something up if you don't think you're really going to lose it. Maybe God's asking us to really give something up today, something that we hold a little too dear. You know, I'm going to close in just a moment. Would you mind playing a little something on the piano? I know, don't everyone look at her, everyone look at me. She hates it when I do that. You know, I want us to spend just a couple minutes in reflection, in introspection. I set apart a little bit of time at the end that I wanted to let me be quiet and let the Holy Spirit talk to you directly without me getting in the way. Because he's smarter than I am and knows your exact situation. I don't. I know my situation, and I have to deal with God in my own way. You know your situation. You know what it is in your life that is something God needs to deal with. If there's anything in your life, spend a few moments. Let's take a pause. Let's bow our heads. Let's give some time to God to speak to us. Let's listen. Let's be aware. And let's see what is it in our life that we might be holding so dear that God might ask us to give up. Let's take just a couple minutes right now. As you're in prayer, as you are hopefully opening your life like a book, God knows everything already. He knows what you hold most dear. Let him reveal it to you. Listen to what he's telling you. Don't be afraid, because God doesn't do things to hurt us. He does things to make life better. And if he's asking us to give something up today, he's doing it to enrich our lives, to make it better, to make our relationship with him closer, which is what we want to do. God had Abraham go through a long 3-day journey, thinking, taking steps closer. Today, if you feel God calling you to give something up, I want to invite you. Stand up. Make a shorter journey, but a difficult one nonetheless. Find your way to the front. Offer at the altar whatever it is God asking you to give up. Hand it to him. physically do something to show that you hear and you're going to obey. We get the opportunity right now to see, are we going to be those who are instantly obedient to the calling of God? Or are we going to put it off? Or are we going to choose disobedience? Or are we going to wait? You may be at a point in your life right now where you've been a Christian for a long time, and perhaps we've gotten to a place where we've been distracted by something, and we need this opportunity to just refocus our direction and our priorities on God. You have an opportunity right now to come up and make a declaration, to show God you're willing to do what it takes to refocus on Him. Perhaps you've never had a relationship with God and you're not quite sure what that entails or what that means, or what you would have to give up. Maybe God is asking for everything. Perhaps God says, you know what? I need everything right now. It's time to give up control of your entire life. What an opportunity to physically show your obedience. Come up and say, God, I know you expect my everything. And I know in the past I've tried to give things here and there, but I've been holding some things back. And that today I'm going to choose to be like Abraham and give up everything, including the control of my life, because I trust that you will do a better job than I will. I know for myself that when I'm in charge, I make a mess of things. But when I give up control to God, He has never failed me. Perhaps you've done that in the past and you just need a time to refresh yourself, to remind yourself. Use this time to talk with God and give Him your everything. Whatever you've ever held back from Him, you can give it to Him now and be closer than you've ever been before to obedience and relationship with God. As we continue in prayer, let's lift our voices up in surrender. All to Jesus I